Hello there. I'm here to talk to you about four dark little books with women at the center of them. That is a very broad theme. It's kind of not even really a theme at all. And that's because I had a misunderstanding about what some of these books were about, and I thought I could connect them on a more specific level than I actually could. So these are the books that I picked out, and they are what we're reading today, even though what's the title going to be of this video? What am I going to put in the thumbnail? I don't know. They are very loosely connected. Thematically, almost nothing is the same about these books. I really have no way to talk about them under the umbrella of a theme. So we're just going to talk about them just as they are on their own separately. What we have here is the Stepford Wives. We have Suture. We have Sealed. And we have Comfort Me with Apples. The thing about them is that they're all short. This looks a little bit long, but the font is really big. I think that some copies of this, some editions, are like 170 pages, so we're counting it. They need to be connected somehow. I am going to let me from the past, who has already recorded most of these segments on these books, talk to you about the Stepford Wives. Hello, I'm here to talk to you about the Stepford Wives. As far as I can tell, this is a book that actually apparently everybody knows. I've definitely heard it referenced before, but I have just managed to completely avoid all of the spoilers. So when I explain what happens to you in this, I hope I don't sound like an idiot. I hope this isn't something that you all know and I was the only one left out of the loop on. But it was so good. It was so good, and I'm so glad that I didn't know what happened in it. I feel so lucky for that. So this follows a woman named Joanna, and her little nuclear family move to Stepford, a town that is incredibly stuck in its very strict gender roles. She gets there and she's so pissed already. She's all for women's liberation. She's so pissed that there's a men's association and they make a lot of the decisions in the town, and women are not allowed at these meetings. And her husband is like, I'm going to join though. And she's like, dude, you can't do that. Like, we talked about how shitty this is. And he's like, no, I'm going to fix it from the inside. And they invited me and I want to go. And so he ends up going, and he goes like around once a week to this men's association. At one point, there's a meeting that happens at their house instead of at the men's association building, which is like this kind of looming building in the middle of town with like this big fence around it, like very protected. And she is like, I'm going to come sit in. And her husband's like, yeah, that's great. Some of these men in this meeting think that women really should not ever be allowed in, and they don't think that women have any great ideas. And I know that you will be very intelligent and you might be able to sway them out of that thinking. And so she does sit in with them, and they kind of treat her like a waitress, but not really, because her husband is, at this point in the book, genuinely a good guy. He is also, in some ways, for women's liberation, and he understands where she's coming from when she complains about the misogyny of this men's association. And so when people want drinks, he goes and gets the drinks. When the kids scream mommy when they're in bed and they're having a nightmare or a fever or whatever, he puts his hand on her arm and he goes to do it instead, so that she can maintain being part of this conversation with the men. Some of the men at this meeting do accept her presence and engage with her while she's here, but the two with the most power don't. The first being the leader of this men's association, and then the second being this illustrator who's like famous, like works for a famous magazine, and he has a lot of like social power. The illustrator doesn't ignore her in the way the leader of the association does, but he instead spends the whole time drawing images of her and really objectifying her. And she takes a little bit of offense to this, but then the beautiful drawing is so beautiful, and he gifts it to her, and it's an original from this guy. They frame it and put it in the house, and she's like, oh, I shouldn't have been so offended. But it is definitely putting her in her place as like something to be looked at. Joanna's a photographer, and she has this weird interaction with a police officer when she goes to take some photos in the middle of the night in town. She's about to take a photo of the building where the men's association meetings are held, and she sees lights on inside, and then this police cruiser rolls up, and he just kind of engages her in a little chat. But she also sees that he stops and like talks to someone on the radio, and when she goes back to take photos, the curtains have been drawn at the men's association, and she's like, that's weird. Like, I think he called someone and told them that I was taking photos, but why would they have a radio up in there? Like, this is so strange. Almost immediately upon moving, Joanna is trying to make change and like drum up support for a women's association or for opening up the men's association. She meets this woman, Bobby, who becomes her very close friend almost immediately, and they are very similar to each other and have really similar opinions. And Bobby feels the same way. She wants to do the exact same things Joanna does. So both of them go out on their own, and they try to get women to join a group, come to a meeting to talk about women's liberation, and none of the women will do it. They're all like, they all say, I gotta clean. Sorry, I gotta wax the floors. I just don't have time. They are doing so much housework. Their houses are like meticulously, perfectly cleaned. And they're like, that's all the time I have. I gotta take care of the kids and I gotta clean. I'm not really interested in women's liberation. Sorry. They can't get anyone to join. Then one day, Joanna is going through the stuff that the person who lived in her house before her had left, and there's a newspaper there, and it is detailing a women's liberation meeting, which was run by the same women who said, I'm not interested in joining your women's lib group. And she's like, this is so weird. Why would no one have said anything to me about this? She ends up kind of interrogating the woman who ran the first women's lib group, and she just says, there was dwindling membership. Like everybody it kind of just slowly petered out. The interest wasn't really there. Joanna and Bobby end up making this friend Charmaine, who's like this very wealthy woman, as you can tell by her name. And all three of them have moved into this town really recently. Charmaine a little bit less recently than Joanna and Bobby. Charmaine and Joanna like to play tennis together. And then one day Charmaine says, I'm going to go on a weekend away with my husband, but let's play tennis like on the Wednesday when we get back. And when Joanna goes to play tennis with her, Charmaine is like, oh my God, sorry, I gotta clean up. There's too much cleaning to do. And she's very strange. This is odd because they have more than enough money to have a cleaner, and they have had a cleaner for a long time. And Charmaine, she's like just lost her personality. And Joanna's like, this is really fucking weird. Bobby ends up telling Joanna that she has a theory that there is some sort of chemical in the water. They live near a whole bunch of like different chemical plants and like technological institutes that a lot of the men in the town work for. Bobby says, I heard in New Mexico there is a town where there's really low crime rates, and that's because there's a chemical in the ground that like dulls everybody's senses and keeps the peace. And I think something like that is affecting the women in this town, and that is why they become these shells of themselves and are so focused on cleaning and housework. Joanna's like, Bobby, that's a little bit crazy. And Bobby's convinced, and they end up together sending a letter to like the health department, who responds back and says everything is fine, you don't need to worry about it. That doesn't convince Bobby. And after this thing happens with Charmaine, Joanna is also thinking, this is weird. I kind of want to get out of here. I'm worried about this happening to me. And so Joanna and Bobby together are looking at somewhere else to live, but neither of their husbands really want to pull their children out of school in the middle of the year. But Bobby is like, I'm getting out as soon as I can find a house. She's convinced that something bad is going to happen if she stays here. And then one day Joanna says, my husband and I are going to go on a little trip together. Will you watch my kid? And Joanna's like, of course. And when Bobby gets back, she is so different. Bobby, with the messy house and the chaotic life, is like all of the other Stepford wives. She is so focused on keeping her house meticulously cleaned. She is calm. She doesn't really have a personality anymore. She doesn't make jokes. She's just like in the role of mother and wife entirely. And Joanna is like, fuck, this is going to happen to me. This happened to Charmaine 4 months after she moved in, and then it happened to Bobby 4 months after she moved in. I've got like 2 weeks before I become one of these Stepford wives. So she goes to her husband and she says, we need to move out of here. I can't do this anymore. I know you didn't want to take the kids out of school, but I am going to lose it. And he's like, why don't we go see a psychiatrist? This is a little bit much. He's like, if the psychiatrist says that you are clear-headed, we will move. I'll be with you. I'll be on your side entirely. And she's like, you know what? I'm suspicious of everything. And then she starts researching. And there is this absolutely wonderful scene that we don't get anymore now that the internet exists, where she goes to the basement of the library and she flicks through all of the different newspapers. Now, this is where the twist comes. And I have not done a good job of laying out what this twist is going to be the way that this book does. There are scenes that set this up beautifully. And when it comes, it's so good. And I think that the twist is done really well because I feel like at whatever point you realize what's happening, it feels rewarding. And it never really feels like it's like really beating you over the head with it, like over explaining it. And it also feels to me that everyone will get to the point where they get what's happening before it's explicitly said. And that always feels good. So she's flicking through the newspapers in the library and she sees that the leader of the men's association, Dale, used to work at Disneyland. And she's like, oh yeah, he's called Diz. I remember that. And it says specifically that he worked in animatronics. And she's like thinking back to this moment that was in the book where she looks at the TV that her children are watching and she's like, oh, why are they watching like Robert Kennedy? And she's like, oh, wait, that's not Robert Kennedy. It just looks exactly like him. It's just a really, really good animatronic. And everything comes flooding into her brain. And she's like, oh my God, they're making robots of the women, which is so silly objectively, but it was so fun. It was such a fun little twist. I loved the way it played out. And you look back and there are so many things that set this up. And it doesn't set it up in a way where I think that you realize exactly right away what's going to happen. But like one of the men's association members comes to her house and he's like, yeah, I'm doing this project on computer algorithms and it's something to do with like voice data. And so he says, could you record a whole bunch of different words for me on these cassettes so I can use it as data? She's like, sure. He's recording so that the robot of her can talk, which is obviously not how it works, but it's still like so fun. I didn't care how inaccurate it was. Or even just like when Bobby gets back from her weekend away with her husband, her skin is cold, that kind of thing. Joanna's like, oh, I'm about to be turned into a fucking robot. And so, which is so stupid when you say it, but it works in this book. I just loved it. I just think it works so well for me. So her husband, who over the course of the book has become far more aligned with the values of the men's association than with his wife's values or the needs that she has. He doesn't seem to care as much about the women's lib movement now that he can have a perfect little housewife robot. He's still playing it nice, but he kind of like locks her in the house a little bit. He's got his like arm up on the wall. He's like, why don't you go upstairs and rest for a little while? Like, you seem a little bit crazy right now. She goes upstairs and she sneaks back down when she hears him talking on the phone, and she sees that he's hidden her purse with her wallet and her keys. So she has to run on foot, and she's trying to get to the house of this woman named Ruth Ann, who has just recently moved into the town, and they're like kind of acquaintances. And she knows Ruth Ann will help her and is not a robot because she's just got here. But she doesn't make it because her husband calls the men's association, and all of the men in the town are on the hunt for her. And she ends up being cornered by them, and they say, hey, we hear that you think we're making robots. Like, that's definitely not what's happening. Why don't we take you to Bobby and she'll prick her finger and it will bleed and you'll know she's not a robot. And they convince her to go to Bobby's house. And she gets to Bobby's house and there's really loud music playing upstairs. And Bobby's holding a knife and she says, come over here so you can see me prick my finger. And Joanna thinks, oh, they've brought me here to kill me. And then it cuts to the last chapter, which is suddenly from Ruth Ann's perspective. And Ruth Ann is just going about her day in Stepford, and she's noticing the things that Joanna noticed, like how meticulously and perfectly the women in the town stack up their grocery carts, things like that. And she gets home, and her husband says, hey, sweetheart, I thought maybe you and I could have a weekend alone this weekend. And the book ends. So I gave this book 5 stars. I thought that it was awesome. I just think that there was nothing that I wanted more from this. It was just such a fun time, such a quick and easy read, and it did everything it was doing and said everything it was saying really well. It was perfectly executed. I thought the prose was cutting and searing and precise and like so incredibly efficient. Like, so much happens within 110 pages, but it doesn't feel like it's overloading you too much with information. Truly not a word is wasted in this book though, and I found myself enjoying every single sentence. I found it to be charmingly written, and I also found the characters to be really charming and really likable and full, and also so realistic and authentic at the same time. This obviously has a really strong feminist message, and it is told in this way through these characters that have really realistic points of view, which I feel like is rare with a book with such a strong message like this. I feel like typically it is beating you over the head with it, and it's either like way too simplistic and dumbed down for a very wide audience, or it's like more feminist, more like academic, or like perfectly articulated than normal people really would be. And this is nothing like that. This feels like how a woman would actually feel in this situation with these really crazy expectations of being a housewife put on her. It just makes sense. And it's crazy to me that it was written by a man. He did a great job. He kind of like changed my mind about things written by men. I don't know. It was just great. I thought it was authentic ideologically, both with the characters, and I felt like this author is a man who really believes in what he was writing in and was really insightful and thoughtful about the topics that he covered. And I kind of liked the way that that contrasted with a sort of corny narrative. I think that that just worked. The narrative is also very, very, very well paced, so fast. So at the same time as you are almost immediately warmed to these characters, you are thrown right into the story and also into the atmosphere. That's one of the strongest parts of this book, is this atmosphere is perfectly and immediately set out. Within like one paragraph, you know exactly where we are, exactly what's happening. The tone is just like there. It doesn't waste any time building up. But it does build up the tension really well. This feels like it plays out like a horror movie, but it's not really like the horror genre. It's just kind of like this disquieting through the whole thing, and I found it to be so compelling and so fun. Not only is there this really authentic feeling feminist message, I think that it is truly an indictment of the men in the story. Though it's a little bit subtle with it, it shows you Walter's shift, her husband, I don't think I've said his name. It shows you his shift over the course of the book, how he cannot play the role of husband and the role of man, and he has to choose one, and he chooses man. Even this man who at the beginning of the book seems like he is a great team player with his wife, he can't do it if he feels threatened, and he will choose to have her be a perfect housewife, no matter how much he pretends or convinces himself that he is also for women's liberation. What he wants is a wife and a mother, and that is, he's happy to turn her into just that. I just think this was so strong in every way. I think this is a great book to read if you are in a reading slump. It's really short. I think you could read it in 1 or 2 sittings very easily, and you will enjoy it thoroughly. I have nothing negative to say about this book. I thought it was awesome. I just had so much fucking fun with this, and I would highly recommend it. And I know I'm late on that. I know everybody apparently knows about the Stepford Wives, but if you don't, like, get on this. Next up, I'm going to read Suture by Nick Brewer, and I will let you know how it is when I'm finished with it. This is another really short one. And then I think the other books these are all really short. So I'll let you know probably within like a couple of days, even though that obviously means nothing to you. It'll be like 5 seconds. So I'll see you then. Hello there. I've had a little situation and I had to rearrange my room a bit, so please bear with me for the next little while as I try to find the optimal place in here to film. This obviously looks nice enough in the background, but I have to hold the microphone, and I'm really not good at doing that because I talk with my hands, and so the whole time I'm moving the microphone away from and towards my face, and it makes the audio quality really bad. So I'm trying to find somewhere where I can set up the mic stand, and I have not got to that point yet. So this is what you're getting for now. So today we are here to talk to you about Suture by Nick Brewer, and I hope that the cat's purring is not completely overwhelming my voice right now. He's really, 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 really needy at the moment. So Suture is a book that I did not like all that much, and I'm going to tell you about it as soon as the cat sits down and I can focus on what I'm trying to say, and as soon as he stops trying to jump into my cup of tea. Thank you very much, little boy. So I actually feel a little bit bad about this book because it does not have all that many ratings on Goodreads. And when I finished with this, I was so frustrated with it. I thought that it was like really honestly quite terrible. And I left at the time what I thought was a kind of funny review. And then I looked back on it and I was like, oh, actually that was really mean. And then I went to go look at it and it had become the top review on Goodreads. And I was like, ooh. Maybe I shouldn't have said it like that. Like, I could have said something a little bit nicer, I think. So the base concept of Suture, it's supposed to be like speculative fiction, but I think that it's offensive to call it that. The concept is that to create art, the 3 women in the story have to remove parts of their bodies. So to make her films, Eva has to remove her eyes to power her camera. To make her paintings, Finn must cut open her chest and remove her lungs and her heart. And then to write her stories, Grace has to use her blood as ink. Now, the problem with this book is that at its core, that is a stupid fucking concept. And I think that that can be said for quite a lot of speculative fiction, but the authors end up doing something interesting with it. I'm so sorry, the cat is so horrible right now. And I know he's not on camera. He's just jumping in and out of my lap and like falling all over the place. He's so stupid. With good speculative fiction, or even okay speculative fiction, the author is able to do something interesting with what is objectively a dumbass concept. And the thing with this book is that it was a stupid concept, and then the book lived up to that. The entire book was stupid. So at the end of the day, I was like, can I really be upset? Like, this was basically what it told me it was going to be. I just think that because I had seen it with the label of spec fic, I had expected a lot more from it, and it did not give me anything. So this very short book is split into 3 separate parts, and those 3 parts are each split up by the 3 women's perspectives, and it jumps very quickly through each of their lives. So it feels very disjointed. I mean, partly because the lives of these women are not connected in any way. They're just living in the same world and creating art in this same world, but it's also disjointed because we only get little glimpses into each of their lives. So it never feels like you get enough of each character to connect to them, and it doesn't feel like there's any depth with the characters, but also with the world. You have created this world where you have to use your body to create art, which is like this very literal, very exact, heavy-handed metaphor, and then you haven't built out the world, so it doesn't feel like it ever makes sense or is really interesting in any way. The book never expands on what is, again, a very silly, ridiculous concept of using your eyes to power your camera or your blood as ink to write your books. It never explains anything whatsoever, and so it's so ridiculously implausible, and then it's also not interesting with its implausibility. There is very little plot whatsoever, which is interesting because in some ways it's trying to be like a horror novel. There's a lot of body horror in this, obviously. If you're like really, really, really sensitive to body horror, definitely don't read this. I don't think you'd be interested in it anyway. I don't think you were going to pick this up. But if you're like a little bit sensitive, I don't know if this will necessarily get to you. It's objectively really gory, but I think it's so beyond anything you could possibly imagine, and the world is not built out enough. Like, how are people surviving this? Like, it never really talks about that at all. It doesn't feel real. It feels so beyond the world that we currently live in that it doesn't make sense as like horror. I just think for horror to be effective, it has to put you into that situation, and this doesn't do that whatsoever. It's like, oh, we're in a room full of people who are painting and they're all gasping when they tear their hearts out. Okay. Like, where are we? What is this? It was very descriptive with the body horror, but it's just so unrealistic. You can read it without feeling really anything at all. So while this book is mainly about these women and their connection to their art, I think even more than that, it's about the relationships in their lives. The 3 of them each have a relationship that is really central to both their life and their art. Finn, who is the painter, she's a mother, and her daughter starts drumming with her arm bone, which when that part came, I was like, can we fucking stop? Can we cut this the fuck out? I'm so tired of this premise. The premise had such limited potential, and yet still I was expecting more from it, and honestly, that is my fault. But it's also the fault of the absolutely glowing Goodreads reviews. I don't know what book you all read, but it was not the same book that I read, because this was honestly dog. I just hated it. So Finn had stopped her art to be a mother because she didn't want to put herself at risk. And then there's Grace, who's like kind of the most interesting one, but also the most forgettable one, who is in this kind of toxic relationship. She's really toxic. Her husband's not toxic. She's like cheating on him and shit, and she kind of ends her life very lonely because of how she's treated people. And then there's Eva, the woman who uses her eyes to power her camera, and she loses her sight because of this. And there's kind of this lovely relationship between her and her wife, even though I still have complaints there, because I wish that it had gotten into actual like commentary or actually saying something about disability. I hate when books just throw in a disabled character just like for plot or for interest, like especially someone who becomes disabled later in life, and it's like, oh my god, she became disabled and her wife like still loved her anyway. And like, look how reliant she is on her wife. Like, can you actually believe that? Like, this is true love. True love is through disability, because disabled people are inherently unlovable. That was just kind of the vibes I got from it. I don't think it was explicitly saying that, but I also don't think it was saying anything interesting. Another message that I hated that this book seemed to have was the message that critiquing art that is made for consumption is like almost inherently cruel to the artist. I think maybe what the author was trying to get at is how vulnerable and like horrific it can be to put your art out there and have people not like it or have people critique it. But these artists would read criticisms that were like actually really level-headed and like really made sense and were really fair, and they would be thrown into a fucking tizzy about it. And it made it seem like the people who were, oh my god, get off my laptop. The book made it seem like the people who were writing The book made it seem like the people who were writing these reviews of the art were being mean, and we were supposed to see them as cruel, and like it should have just been people who loved the art all the time. You should never say anything mean about someone's art because it might hurt their feelings, which now that I'm thinking about it, I wish I hadn't left such a mean Goodreads review because she's probably going to see it. It was not nice at all. But also that concept is ridiculous. If you are making art, you have to allow people to say mean things about it, or not even mean things. What I said was kind of mean, but you have to allow people to say things about it that are critical and still reasonable and level-headed and generous. That, I don't know. I saw that thread throughout the entire book, and I thought it was silly every single time. Other problems that I had with this book is that I thought that it was too long because it wasn't saying anything and it never got to any point. It was kind of a character study, but it was supposed to be some sort of speculative fiction and then doesn't do anything with the speculative fiction. So you're just thrown into this world with no explanations or any like elaboration on anything that's going on, and then you're just stuck there, like watching these pretty boring, shallow characters doing nothing. And so that made it too long, but then it was also at the same time too short because it never got into anything, and I wanted to know what the fuck was going on. The whole time I was reading it, I was thinking, is this really it? Is this the whole book? Like, is there not going to be something to grasp onto? It was like we just had this concept of you take your blood and you use it for ink, which already, like I said, like that's such a stupid concept. It's like that concept was there, and then we wrote around it, but not beyond it. There was nothing more added to the conceptualization of this book. Are you joking? There was nothing more added to the conceptualization of this book. It was a stupid premise that was never built upon. And also, it was very poorly proofread. There were a lot of mistakes in this book. They stood out to me every single time, and it felt really like the editing was super disconnected. It almost felt like there maybe was not an editor or a proofreader for this book, and it definitely had the vibes of a debut. And a debut from an author who I'm not really interested in reading anything more from. I don't think it was creative. I think it thinks it's going to be creative, and then it's not. It does nothing with what could be an interesting, yet again, stupid concept. It kind of just fizzles out. Kind of meanders all over the place, says nothing. I really did think this was going to be something feminist, honestly, which maybe it was stupid of me, but it's surrounding 3 women who use their actual physical bodies and harm themselves to make art. Does that not sound like it's going to have some sort of like feminist commentary in it? I was really expecting that, and it really didn't at all, and I think that has kind of screwed up the concept of this video, because this video was supposed to be something. It was supposed to be like reading speculative fiction about the patriarchy or something like that, and then I realized that one of the books is actually not really speculative fiction at all, and that this isn't really about the patriarchy or feminism. I'm gonna kill him. I'm gonna actually strangle him. What is it that you want? I think that for you to write speculative fiction, or to try to call your book speculative fiction, you do have to be saying something. I think that's part of the genre, and this book had nothing to say. It had a core concept that was never built upon in any meaningful way. While it is horror, it's not horror. It's not effective horror. It's not good horror. It doesn't feel like it's written by someone who is familiar with either of the genres that this book is trying to occupy. I thought every aspect of this book was shallow, and that the whole thing was done in just a really lackluster way. And I know that I have been incredibly cruel about this, but it was honestly really bad, and I can't think of anything nice or positive to say about it. And honestly, I might be missing something. I saw so many people. To be fair, it has very few reviews, and I think when a book has very few reviews, they tend to skew really positive. Pretty much everyone was just like absolutely applauding this book for what it was doing. But I didn't find anyone explaining to me what it was doing. Maybe I have missed something massive, and I'm willing to accept that. And I would love, if you've read this, please tell me what the fuck I'm missing, because it was not good to me, and I would like to like it more than I did. I would like to have something to take away from this or something to think about with this, and I just don't have that right now. So if you've read it, please let me know what you think. The next book I'm reading is Comfort Me with Apples, and I will talk to you about it soon, probably sitting in a different position in the room because this is not very comfortable. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye. Hello, I'm here to talk to you about Comfort Me with Apples. Now, I am going to spoil this book almost immediately. I went into this knowing this spoiler, and then when I read reviews, I saw a lot of people saying that they were shocked when they figured out what this really was, and I didn't get that. And I wonder if the book would have been better to me if I had. So I'm letting you know right now, this is going to be spoiled like pretty much immediately, like in 1 second. And I can hear the tape. If any of you have walls that look even remotely like my walls, you will know that the sound of tape peeling off a wall haunts your fucking nightmares. It is, oh my god. Some spots on a wall just tape won't stick to it. And you can't get tape to stick to it no matter what you do. Wipe it down with alcohol all you want. Tape will not stick to that part of the fucking wall. And I want things on the wall. And oh my god, it's driving me nuts. So if things start falling down behind me, just know I'm losing it. Okay, here's the spoiler right off the bat. Comfort Me with Apples is a retelling of Adam and Eve. I'm not really familiar with any stories from any religion. I know the gist of Adam and Eve, but I think that there is a lot more to it, and that was packed into this book, and I didn't get what was a reference and what wasn't a reference. So if you're really familiar with biblical stories, you might take a little more interest in this book. And I think it's worth reading because it's really short. I sat in a cafe and read it in like an hour and a half, and it's hard for me to read when I'm out in public. I like to read sitting on my couch with my white noise playing in my headphones, and I thought that it was really manageable. So if you have any interest whatsoever, I would recommend it, but I don't think you should expect a book that's like really good. Okay, let's talk about what happens in it. It follows this woman named Sophia, and it starts with her in the big massive house that she lives in with her husband, who is not called by a name because his name is Adam, and we're not supposed to know that till the end, apparently. I went in knowing that. Whatever. She's in this house, and she is, oh my god, such like classic misogyny. The really boring and tired kind where it's like, I'm a little housewife, and I do everything for my husband, and I'm small, and he's big, and I'm gonna make him dinner, and he wants me to stay safe, so I let him control me in any way that that he wants to, and I can't go in the basement because it's too dangerous, because I'm just a little baby. And it's like, okay, I'm like, okay, I get it. It's about misogyny. Thank you so much. You've done such a good job depicting a really nuanced and realistic version of misogyny. That's awesome. Good job, Cathrynne. I'm sorry, I know that type of misogyny does absolutely still exist in the world today. It's just like, it's so overrepresented at this point that the more insidious and more, in my opinion, interesting aspects of misogyny are left unexplored and unrepresented, and then we kind of just overlook them. And you have to go to like TikTok and Twitter to see people talking about how misogyny actually like materially affects their lives in really hidden ways that are hidden because they're not represented. Anyone, even the most misogynistic pig who thinks women belong in the fucking kitchen, can read this book and see, this has ideas about gender that are very, very, very conservative, at the very least. This has ideas about the roles of men and women that are really strict. And I think that's boring. I'm just tired of it. I'm sorry. And I'm saying that. I just told you about how much I love the Stepford Wives. I thought that was fresh and new and fun, even though it's a very similar type of story that it's telling. I think this was honestly really derivative of the Stepford Wives, and not in a good way. I don't know. You can do it in an interesting way. Cathrynne did not. So Sophia lives with her husband in this gated private community that has incredibly strict rules. And each chapter is ended with a chapter that is just more rules from this HOA that she's in. And the rules become increasingly strict and insane. Right at the beginning of the book, Sophia finds a hairbrush in her vanity that doesn't belong to her. And beside it is a lock of coarse, dark hair that does not match her hair whatsoever, and she's incredibly unsettled by this. And she takes it over to the neighbor's house, the neighbors who she's having tea with, who are all named after animals, which must be an Adam and Eve thing. And oh my god, I'll get into how annoying that was, but the way it was like, look, I named them after animals. Can you see it? So irritating. Anyway, she takes this hairbrush over to her neighbor's place. And she says, I'm a little bit freaked out by this. And they're like, you got nothing to worry about. You probably have tons of hairbrushes. You're so wealthy. You're so beautiful. Your husband's not cheating on you. You don't need to worry about it at all. He loves you more than anyone. And everyone is so jealous of your relationship. And then some guy comes into the house. He's like visiting the neighborhood. And she's like struck by him. And as far as I can remember, honestly, not much more happens with him. He's like saying, "Oh, I'm hunting, not hunting." He's like, he is technically hunting, but he says like, "I'm a policeman and I'm trying to find a woman who's messing with the community. She left and she voided her contract and now she needs to be punished for it," or something like that. I don't know. This must be a biblical reference that I don't understand because it did not really make sense in the context of the story if you just read it at face value and you don't think of it as so incredibly tied to the story of Adam and Eve. I think he was like an angel. I think he was named after an angel, though I'm still not 100% sure. He's there and he kind of freaks her out a little bit. She's like really drawn to him and she feels really uncomfortable with this. Then she goes to this play that the town is putting on. She goes with her husband. And they're putting on this play of the day that she arrived in town, that she moved into this house that her husband has built for her. And she's like, "Oh, I'm so loved here. Like, they love me so much." But then the woman who's playing her is wearing a wig of this coarse, dark hair. And she brushes her hair in the play and puts the hairbrush that she uses into the same drawer of the vanity that Sophia found the hairbrush in her house. And she's like, "Ooh, this is a bit weird. I wonder what's going on here." And after the play ends, her husband is pissed off and he's like, "Oh, I'm just in a really bad mood. I'm just going to go." That night, Sophia goes back to her place, and when she's making dinner, she puts the knife back in the knife block, but it gets jammed. So she shakes the knife block out, and out comes a little bone. And she realizes, and I think what is the most well-written line of the book, that she's standing in her kitchen holding the tip of a human finger. So then, of course, over the night, she tears her entire house apart. And as she does this, she finds more and more and more body pieces and locks of hair. And it's gross. There's like a little bit of dried up lung. There's a vial of brown blood. There's so much hair. And she looks at it all laid out and she's like, "Oh, this is not just one woman. This is a lot of body parts from a lot of different women." And she runs out of her house and she goes into the forest. It's late, and the HOA, you're not allowed to leave your house at night because they have these crazy fucking rules. So she goes out and she's in the forest and she meets this man, and he's obviously the snake. I know there's a snake in Adam and Eve. I know at least that much. And he's named after a type of snake. And I like looked it up because I was like, I bet this guy's named after a type of snake. And then he was. And then like 2 pages later, the book told me that he was, which was like kind of boring. Whatever. I think it should have left that up to you, especially because it's like such a clear retelling of this story. Leave some things up to the audience, please. You can't just do like a 1-for-1 Adam and Eve. It's so annoying. So she meets the snake man, and they have this weird long conversation where he's telling her about how she's not the first woman, and her husband has had a lot of different wives, and most of them figure out what he's doing like she has, and they don't make it out. And then he offers her the apple, and she takes a bite of the apple, and he's like, "Hey, you should feed the apple to your husband." She also finds a key in the apple, which is a key to the basement that she's been locked out of this whole time. So she goes home and she goes into the basement that her husband has locked her out of. And in there, she finds just a whole bunch of more dead bodies. And she also finds a grave dug for her size. And she thinks to herself, damn, this house wasn't made for me because I'm a small little baby. And I live in this house with a bed that I need a step stool to get into and a set of stairs that are way too big for me. They take me half an hour to get down. This house was made for someone else. And then her husband gets there and he's like, "Hey, what are you doing in the basement? Also, that apple pie you made smells really delicious." And the book ends with them having a conversation about how the husband is basically like trialing a whole bunch of different women that he gets his dad, God, I think, to create. And it's not going well for him because he always ends up like falling out of love with them, or they fall out of love with him, and they're never like the perfect housewife. They always decide to leave, decide to take the apple. And that's kind of the end of the book. That's really it. The book ends with Eve, who I think is the final iteration of this woman that Adam is trying to create to be the perfect housewife for him. So I'm sure I sound like an idiot talking about this because I'm not really familiar with the story of Adam and Eve. And I'm sure that this book reads a lot more interesting and a lot more creative for people who know exactly what is going on in the book. But I think that you do kind of need that background to really understand this book. And in that sense, I think it's not a very good retelling. I also think that it is not all that creative, and that makes me feel like it is, again, not a very good retelling. It was very heavy-handed in the fact that it was a retelling. I think that it's not trying to market itself as what it is. I think at the end you're supposed to be like, oh my god, it's Adam and Eve, but everybody says that in like the first line of every single Goodreads review, and also it's marked on Goodreads as a retelling, and so it's hard not to avoid the spoilers that is what it is. So I think that they couldn't really manage the marketing for this book as well as they wanted to. They wanted that to be a surprise, for sure. I read lots of things that said that that was the intention here, and it's just not really feasible in the internet age. People are going to see what this book is about, especially when like the only way to describe it is to describe it as an Adam and Eve retelling. So I know that my opinion on this is biased because I went in knowing that that is what this book was, but I did think it was really heavy-handed with it. Like she says, I was made for him 1,000 fucking times. Or like I talked about with everyone in the town being named after an animal, it's like Mrs. Elk, but there's an E at the end. Or Mrs. Fish, but there's a C and an E added in there. Or Mrs. Bear, but the A and the E are switched. It is not as clever as the book thinks it is, and it feels like you are being beat over the head with a fucking baseball bat. Look at this. Look at all of the last names. Look at how they're named after animals, and look at how I'm kind of describing the people as the animals that they're named after. Do you see it? Can you see what I did? You're a little bit dumb. You can't see what I did. I'm going to explain it again. I'm going to show you again and again and again and again. Absolutely tiring. The person who reads this and at the end when it's all explained is like, oh my god, they were named after animals? Needs a lobotomy. Something I thought was either interesting and intentional or weird and unintentional and like lazy maybe or unskilled was the fact that this book takes place in this really strange time setting. It's completely unplaceable. Like they have this HOA, but then also I feel like things are lit by candlelight. But then also like there's a piano, and then also they talk like it's 1600. But then at the very end, when her husband has like the mask has come away and it's shattered and he is like exposed as who he really is, when they're having this conversation, he's talking to her in a very like casual 21st century kind of way, and it's so strange and so out of place, and I don't know if that was on purpose or not. I would like to decide that it was, and I think that it was interesting, and it created this really like disquieting, like weird atmosphere. Another thing that I thought was interesting in this book is that at the beginning, Sophia is recognizing what is pretty clearly fear behaviors from her neighbors towards her husband as jealousy towards him or lust towards him, depending on the gender of the neighbor. And I liked how blindsided she was by her love for her husband and her seemingly perfect relationship, that she saw all of these little things as something that it was basically the opposite of. More than anything, I thought this book was really mediocre. It had a very pretentious writing style for a book that is not as clever as it thinks it is, and that is always really hard to read. That dissonance is like genuinely, oh my god, it's so uncomfortable. Like to have someone write in this way where it's like so uppity and so fucking pretentious and use these big words, and then your book is kind of stupid. Ooh, I'm embarrassed for you. Oh, I need to look away. Though I will say, there is a lot more to gain from this that I didn't get because I am not Christian, and I have not lived a life that has been like so overly indoctrinated with specific Christian stories. Obviously, I live in North America. Christian values rule this fucking part of the world. But like the specifics of religion and religious stories are not really something that I have ever been familiar with. And I think that if it's something that you were familiar with, you'll get a lot more out of this than I did. I think I am really truly missing a lot from this book. But I can tell, despite that it's not written all that well. Though I think I understand people who really like it because they just have this cultural context that I'm totally missing. But that's that on that. I don't really have anything more to say about that book. It was so incredibly short. It's hard to pull more opinions out of it than that. The next book I'm reading is the longest book, but it's like 200 pages, and that is Sealed by Naomi Booth. And I'm going to talk to you about it when I'm finished with it. I'm like 20 pages in. So I'll see you later. Hello, I'm here to talk to you about Sealed by Naomi Booth. This was recommended in the book club Discord by Ava, and I'm not afraid to say that because I did think that this was good. Probably Ava, I would have left your name out if I hated this book, I'll be completely honest. I feel like that might have been a bit embarrassing for you, but you killed it. This was a great little horror book. So Sealed is sort of a pandemic novel, but it's an interesting take on a pandemic novel. It was written before the pandemic that we have all lived through. Thank God. I don't want to talk about that in books. This is following this woman who's very pregnant, and her husband move out of the city because she is having crazy anxiety about this pandemic. Now, the pandemic is not really something that is going to affect her all that greatly because it is treatable, or at least the officials say that it's treatable. She thinks that everything is a conspiracy, and she seems to be pretty correct on this, but it is true that it's largely poor, homeless people of color who are dying from this pandemic, disease, plague, whatever's going on. What it is it's this like body horror thing where your body seals itself up. Like all of your orifices get sealed up by extra skin growth. And usually people die from it through suffocation when their mouth and nose is covered up. It is treatable through plastic surgery. She probably doesn't really have all that much to worry about, but you can see here clearly where this book is going. It is about a woman who is pregnant, living in a world where there's a pandemic, where people's orifices are sealed up, and that is where it goes. Okay, let's get a little bit more into what happens in this book. Alice and her husband Pete move into, I think, like rural Australia. I think this book is set in Australia. They move to this rural little town because she is overwhelmed with anxiety about the pandemic. She's kind of like the only person who's really super worried about it, but she is really super worried about it. And a lot of this is like first pregnancy anxieties manifesting in this fear over this pandemic that's happening, but also some of it is pretty reasonable. She worked in the city at the Department of Housing, and she could see a lot of what was going on behind the scenes with what was happening here and with what the officials were trying to cover up and keep everybody calm. And she logged a lot of stuff because she felt like there was not enough information out there for everyone, and that she could see a lot of things that were being covered up. She had a blog. She kept meticulous records of everything that was going on, and it was truly driving her nuts. And her husband, Pete, who's kind of a piece of shit guy, he's like, you have nothing to be worried about and you're just causing yourself harm, which sounds reasonable enough. It's hard for me to explain why Pete is such a terrible partner to her, but he is. He takes her to this rural little town and he basically says, don't talk about the fucking pandemic. Don't talk about the disease. I don't want to hear it. You need to be someone who you're not. You need to be someone who is not anxious about this. And if you start doing that record keeping, I'm going to go fucking nuts, okay? Pete is this guy. He's like a very specific breed of guy who's like really happy to throw his wife under the bus at any opportunity. In what he says is like a joking way, he's really friendly and he wants to make friends with people in the town, and he will happily go into a bar with her. He'll happily get shit-faced, and he will happily talk about how miserable and grumpy his wife is, and then nudge her and go, just joking, babe. It's so awful, and I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but it does read as a very realistic portrayal of this kind of man. So Pete's always trying to make friends, but they're not really being welcomed into this town. I mean, at the core, they are a city couple who has moved into this smaller rural town with limited, like, strapped resources to take up time and space and money from the resources that the people in the town don't really have access to anyway. And they can see that she is visibly 9 months pregnant, and they're like, oh, you came here? You came all the way here to give birth to your baby? To use up all of our resources? People can't get into the hospital. People are sick and dying here, and you've come all the way here to take our resources, you fucking city people. It is hostile for sure, but there's also definitely some reason and logic behind the response that they get by the townsfolk. And we can see the root of this hostility when Alice goes to the surgery, which I think is like the doctor's office, and she goes to get registered so that she can get a midwife. And when she goes, the place is absolutely overrun with poor, sick people who are in clear agony and suffering. And a nurse very quickly turns her away. And she says, "We're experiencing a rapidly changing situation. This is only for emergencies. You're going to have to just go to the hospital. We're not going to be able to get you a midwife. We just don't have the resources." This, of course, really freaks Alice out, especially because she has been in this room filled with people who have this sickness. Though, a way that this is an interesting take on pandemic, and I like this a lot. I liked it in Severance by Ling Ma as well. It's not communicable person to person. They're not 100% sure how it's communicated, but it seems to be something about environmental pollutants. And that is really present in this book. This is definitely like a climate horror type of book. So while Alice is afraid of people who have this disease, she is mostly occupied with trying to keep her body clean because it's speculated that this disease is caused by the body trying to protect itself from environmental pollutants. And that's most of the book. Most of the book is Alice being afraid of the outside world, being afraid of the carcinogens that come off of blackened meat on the barbecue, being afraid of food that isn't labeled as protected. Almost all 200 pages of this book is Alice being afraid of harms that are not all that direct and not all that urgent. Harms that we all experience currently, right now. The same carcinogens, the same environmental pollutants. That is what she is overcome with anxiety about. Because like I said, this disease is not fatal. It's not something that is necessarily going to kill her if she gets it. It is treatable for people who have the money and the resources to treat it. But her anxiety is also compounded by the fact that no one will listen to her. No one has the same fears that she does. And I mean, that is in part because this is a treatable disease. It is also in part because it is this kind of cover-up thing that she feels like she can see into the inside of and knows more about what's happening than everyone else because of these records that she's keeping about everything going on and all the cases that she's seen. And this is a really interesting part of this book because it is so frustrating that no one will listen to her fears and her anxieties, but it is also true at the same time that she is being paranoid about this, that she doesn't really have all that much to worry about. But everyone telling her that there's nothing for her to worry about is only making her fears grow stronger. If she was offered some sort of comfort by someone, even if that comfort came in the form of someone saying, "This is as serious as you think it is," she would be less paranoid. That she would be better off for that. So though as a partner to his wife, he is insufferable and a terrible, irritating guy, Pete does manage to make some friends. And he makes Alice go to this barbecue. And she's very afraid, of course, of this barbecue. There's cigarette smoke everywhere. There's a barbecue, like I said, with the blackened meat, all of these carcinogens. She's like, none of this food has been labeled as protected. She starts having a panic attack, and she ends up being comforted by this woman, Mara, who is the wife of Polly, who's Pete's friend. They're hosting the barbecue. Mara takes her off. She is also a new mother, and they have like just a really nice, friendly moment. Mara can see her anxieties and her fears, and she does kind of offer her some comfort. And then at the end of this moment, Mara mentions that the government is trying to force everybody out of the town because there's been an outbreak of this disease. And of course, Alice freaks the fuck out and she makes Pete drive her back home. And Pete is really upset with her. The only solution that Pete ever offers is for her to stop thinking about it and stop talking about it, or at the very least, keep it out of his life. He doesn't want to hear anything about this fucking pandemic. So of course, as we know is going to happen, because this is a book about a woman who is heavily pregnant, she ends up going into labor. They don't have a phone hooked up, and the nurse at the doctor's office told her that she's going to have to call ahead to the hospital when she goes into labor because there's maybe not going to be enough beds. And if there aren't enough beds, she'll have to go to a different hospital that's a bit farther away. So Pete rushes out of the house and he drives down to the neighbor's house so he can use their phone to call the hospital and see if there's beds. Now, they had been to the neighbor's house way earlier on in the book, and they had gone to ask if in an emergency like this, she's having her baby a few weeks premature, if they could use this man's phone. And they go to their neighbor's house earlier in the book, and they say, hey, can we use your phone? And he says, I'm going to shoot you if you don't get off my property right fucking now. So they leave immediately. When they're there that first time, the man is saying things about people trying to drive them off their property. And displacement and dislocation is a huge theme in this book. I mean, Alice in the City worked for the Department of Housing. She was very much in the weeds of those processes. And that is something that is happening to a lot of more rural and more poor areas in, again, what I assume is Australia here. So he's talking about how he doesn't want to be pushed off of his property and how the people who came trying to move him into social housing or into these camps had made his wife sick. But he only really mentions it a little bit, and we never really go back and see more about him until Pete doesn't return home when he goes to use this man's phone. This is like pretty expected. Like, what did you really think was going to happen, Pete? But there's still some shock here. Alice is alone for hours. She has no way to contact anyone else. So she ends up walking in horrific, so descriptive, so detailed explanations on this labor that she's in that is like destroying her. It's almost killing her. She walks the half-an-hour walk to this old man's house. And when she gets there, she sees him lying on the floor with a rifle beside him, and he's emaciated. He's like 80 pounds. He's barely alive. He can't really lift his head. And she says, I need to use your phone. I'm sorry. I'm in labor. And he points to a dead woman's body on a chair. She's been dead like maybe a week or so. And then he points again to the phone, and she rushes over to the phone, and he says, it's dead. The phone's dead. He shouldn't have come here. I told him the phone was dead. I told him to get out. And then she looks at the ground by the phone, and there is Pete's dead body. He has been shot by this old man. So now Alice is fully alone in the middle of nowhere in labor, and she has to walk the half an hour back to her place. Here I don't really understand why she didn't take the car that Pete had took over. It also never says that she sees the car in the driveway when she gets there. I think that was a little bit of a plot hole, but I also understand that she is in crazy shock and grief seeing her partner's dead body on the ground and also being in fucking labor alone. She ends up having the baby, but she has to cut herself open because she can feel it pushing, and when she looks down, there is a new layer of skin that is closing her up, and she cannot give birth to this baby. So she has to grit her teeth and cut through it. It is absolutely horrific. It's like the most horrific birth scene I've ever read in my life. And when the baby comes out, she comes out cold and blue, and she's just lying there on the ground. And Alice is sitting there staring at her in absolute shock. And then there's a knock at the door, and it's Mara. And Mara is here to kind of save the day. Mara is like, oh my God, what the fuck happened? And she picks up the baby. She's like, oh, she's so cold. You have to hold her. And Alice is like, no, Mara, she's dead. Like, the baby's dead. Alice is like, oh my God, this is so mortifying. Mara doesn't know that the baby's fucking dead. The baby starts crying. She's not dead. She's like a little bit premature, but she is okay. Mara says they're evacuating us right now. They say that there's an outbreak and they want to move us into these social housing camps, but we're not going. We're like staging a sit-in because we know what happens here. We know that people get moved to the camps temporarily, and then their homes are never able to move back into them. And this is all because the government wants to not have to fund and resource these rural places. But Mara's like, we have to get you some help. You have to go to a hospital. And so she sacrifices her house, knowing that if she leaves with Alice, she's not going to get her house back. She sacrifices like her fucking livelihood for Alice. And so that is the hopeful note of the story. But the bleak note at the end of this story is that the two women listen as all of the animals around them are like succumbing to this disease. They listen as the birds are blinded by the disease and are flying into windows and flying into trees and falling to the ground. And Alice thinks to herself, I have to have hope for this baby. I have this fucking baby to take care of. I have to believe that we'll be okay. So I think this was my favorite kind of horror, though it's not my favorite horror book ever. I think it did have the elements that I really like, which is that it had a fast plot and it also had a lot of social commentary, and that is what I'm looking for in horror. And I think that it is a genre that is well suited to getting into the fucking depths of some social commentary, and this book did it really well. It talked a lot about, like I said, displacement and dislocation and immigration, and there is a lot of like weird racism in here that I didn't really understand what was happening at first, because it's so filled up with Australian slang that I am not privy to. And so there would be words and I would be like, oh, I wonder what that means. And then I would look it up and it would have like that little triangle with the exclamation mark. It would say derogatory. I'm like, oh, this is full of, that's a slur. Oh, I didn't know it was a slur. It's a slur. We're saying slurs. A lot of this book is about class, about rural and urban politics. I really liked the exploration of Alice as this woman who had grown up like on an estate, not wealthy whatsoever, with a single mother, and then had kind of made her way out of that poverty and then moved into this town and still felt a kinship with the people in the town and their class status, even though she didn't really have that kinship. They definitely didn't feel it with her. And I thought it was really interesting how she had come to this town to take their resources away and how the town responded with hostility because of that. I think that was very realistic. I also thought it was interesting how Alice was so intent on like tracking and recording everything about this disease, except it felt very self-serving. And I don't think that she herself recognized it as a self-serving thing. I think she thought that she was doing a service to the people, letting them know, giving them the information that she had, when in reality, this disease that really just kills incredibly poor people and people of color and immigrants and like refugees, she was really just tracking her own risk, which like at the end of the day, there really wasn't one. Even if you are surrounded by cases of this, you have the ability to cure it. It's not a fatal disease for Alice. And I thought that was just so interesting. I think that while the characters of Pete and Alice were both pretty simplistic, they were very distinct, which is so hard to describe. I just felt like I really understood who they were, even though there isn't like a massive amount of depth to them, and they're not like so singular. They are just kind of like, this is Pete, and he's like an irritating guy who doesn't really care about his wife's needs, but he's irritating in a very distinct, specific way. Or like, this is Alice, and she's an anxious pregnant woman. And you could think that she's kind of one note, but she's not, because she's an anxious pregnant woman in a really distinct, specific way. It's impossible to describe. I know I sound like a dork, but that was something that I noticed. They were both simple and distinct at the same time. I don't know how to explain it any better. Like, okay, for example, with Alice, she is simultaneously so incredibly skeptical of everything. She thinks that there's this huge cover-up that's going on, but she's also incredibly naive at the same time. Like, she will only eat food that has the protected status, which is just like trusting the government that the food is protected, when she has set out, like really firmly declared that she doesn't trust the government and she thinks that they're covering up the true risk of this pandemic. I thought that was very realistic. I think that is how a lot of people pick and choose what to believe and what to trust. Because of course, like, what is she going to do? If she believes that all food is risking giving her this disease that she is so overwhelmingly anxious about, how is she going to possibly live? She has to believe, for her own sanity, for her own sake, she has to believe that this protected status means something. There's another interesting thing with Alice's character where it's really exploring her feelings about inhabiting the role of mother, being someone who has just recently lost her own mother. She doesn't want her baby to have the same relationship with her as she had with her mom. She didn't have like the best time ever with her mom, also not the worst time ever. It certainly wasn't abusive. It wasn't a happy childhood, though, and her mom has recently died, and this has left her with a lot of feelings. And these feelings are expressed with her repeatedly asking Pete to call his mom to ask his mom questions about the pregnancy and about whether she should be nervous about things, if things are normal, that kind of stuff. And you don't really know why she's so specifically on Pete to call his mom until you learn that her mom has recently died. And then at the end of the book, it does end up that her and her baby are mirroring her and her own mother as just the two of them, her in this single motherhood. And I think it's interesting to think about how she's going to deal with that and how she's going to deal with the clear ramping up of the seriousness of this disease that she has been so anxious about for months. It's not necessarily like an open ending in the traditional sense, but I think it leaves you a lot to think about with how Alice is going to survive in this world with her baby. And I liked it. I thought this book was very descriptive. It was urgent. It was gory. I liked how colloquial the language was. I can't fucking say that word, and I think I just did a really good job of saying it. I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. I didn't stumble over it at all. I liked how much slang there was, even though I learned that lots of it was slurs that I just wasn't familiar with. I enjoyed how naturally it felt to me that these people were speaking. And I think that gave it a pretty good sense of atmosphere. I always read the little like author bio at the end of books because I like to know where the author is from, because I think usually authors set books in the country that they live in, unless it is explicitly otherwise stated, like this book is in New York, we're in LA, like that kind of thing. I never read books in LA. I feel like every book is set in New York if it's not set where the author lives. So I always go to the back, and I saw that this author was born and raised and still lives in the UK. And the whole time I was like, is this in the UK? Like, wait, why are we talking about indigenous people? I don't think this is in the UK. And I'm pretty certain it's Australia, though it's never explicitly stated. I think it is. And I feel like it does a pretty good job of giving you a kind of ambiguous setting, but also a very strong sense of place, or maybe a very strong sense of culture. This is a very interesting read, and it's a very quick read, even though you are isolated inside Alice's head, the same way she's isolated in her own head. And it is suffocating in there. And I think it definitely could have leaned a little bit more boring, because it's fast, but there's not a ton of plot. It's not overrun with plot, but I wanted to know each and everything that was going to happen. And I was interested in the characters enough to be really compelled by their backstories and by when like little reminiscings. When she reminisces, I was really interested to hear about that. And I liked how she kind of like created narratives. I think that's something that authors often do, where people are looking back and they tell it like a story, even though it's a memory in their own head. It's like very, like, even she'll like, it won't even be a memory. It'll just be something that she's imagined. Like the people in her city who found the first victim, this homeless man who had died at the dump, she imagines it so narratively. And sometimes you read something like that and you're like, this is just the author being an author and not being able to write something that isn't like strictly a narrative with dialogue and everything. But this felt like it was incorporated really well. Like it was how Alice would think about it. Like she creates these narratives in her head. That is just part of the book. And that made all of her little flashbacks and all of her little made up stories really interesting to read. I think this is a great little horror novel, and I would highly recommend it. And thank you again to Ava for recommending that in the book club chat. By the way, if you want to join the book club, you can. We're reading the Pisces right now, and everybody's hating it. I didn't hate it, but everybody else is. I keep picking books that everybody hates. So if you want to join a book club and read some books that you're probably not going to like, you should go and join the book club. Or if you want to join the book club and just so you can get in the Discord and get some book recommendations like this. Ava sent this recommendation and showed us a completely different cover of it, which I was relieved about, because this is horrible and I never would have picked this up because I think this is a fucking awful cover. But there's a different cover that's a lot nicer, and that made me interested enough to go and look at it on Goodreads. You know, don't judge a book by its cover or whatever, but that's fucking awful. You can't tell me that's not awful. Anyways, link in bio. That was hard to say. Anyway, I'm getting out of here. I have read these 4 books now. There was no theme, so I have no final closing thoughts. I really liked 2 of them. Well, I really liked one of them. One of them was pretty good. 2 of them were pretty terrible. So that's what I have to say about that. Themeless. I'm sorry. I'll do better next week. I will see you then. Okay, bye.